Hey, this is Steve Zeltzer with WorkWeek Radio, and I'm with Louis Carlet. He's with Tozen, which is a Japanese union. And maybe you can talk about your union, and then we'll get into the issue of the Kanama construction workers. Welcome to WorkWeek, Louis.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. It's good to be here. So Tozen Union is as you said, it's a Japanese union. It's the most multinational union in Japan. We have members from dozens of different countries, and we're a fighting union. We strike more than any labor union in all of Japan, and we're really trying to make a difference in the labor movement over here. So.
And there are independent unions in Japan. The main union federation is Rengo. When was your union established?
Our union was established in April of 2010, and I should say that it's true that Rengo is the main, super federation for unions, and they're very moderate and conservative. Technically, we actually belong to Rengo, and there are a small number of militant unions within Rengo, and our kind of purpose was we thought if we wanted to really make an impact on the labor movement that we should do it from within Rengo. So I just want to put that out there. So full disclosure.
Okay, so one of the so one of the less covered stories in mainstream media is the growing repression of a militant trade union movement in Japan. So why don't you talk about the Abe government, how more and more militant unions are coming under attack, and the attack on democratic rights?
Yeah, well, definitely with the Abe government, there's been a lot of legal changes, both to labor law and, as I'm sure you know, the new Conspiracy Act. And Abe has taken a really authoritarian approach, and especially towards anything like labor unions. One thing is even our labor union has been affected. Our president, Hifumi Okunuki, used to work for Japan Times, and a few years back, Japan Times changed their editorial policy in a huge right-wing shift. And there's been a lot of talk about pressure from the prime minister's residence, that they thought Japan Times was too critical of the government, and that it was giving Japan a bad image overseas. So basically, they cracked down on Japan Times, and among the journalists and writers that they kind of pushed out was our union president, Hifumi Okunuki, who used to write a very pro-labor, pro-union article once a month called Labor Pains. Now she's over at Shingetsu News Agency, and she continues to write articles from there. Abe is clearly very anti-union and anti-worker. When he makes decisions, he talks with what's called the Keidanren, which is the Japan Federation of Businesses, and he usually has either no union representation or just one leader of Rengo, which is very pro-management super federation. So recently, of course, the big scandal is the crackdown on Kanama, which is a union of concrete mix drivers and related workers in that industry. And they go pretty far back. They've long been a very strong militant union. What they've done is they work for subcontractors of major construction companies. And what they do is they not only organize the workers, they actually organize the subcontractors so that they can have a unified voice when negotiating with the construction company. So one of the ways that working conditions are kept down is through the system of some subcontractors. And many industries that have a major company like an automaker, and then they have subcontractors and then subcontractors. And as you go down, the workers have less and less say in their conditions, and the conditions themselves are much worse. So Kanama has been very successful in fighting back against this. And they've pretty much defended their conditions for a long time. And then recently, about a year or a year and a half ago, they got into a dispute, and then the police in several prefectures, including Kyoto and Osaka, this is Western Japan, the police cracked down on them. They arrested and detained many of the leaders, some of whom are still being detained as the criminal case, slowly grinds forward. So for us, we at Tozen Union were very outraged by this. We see it as a complete violation of the rights as unionists, which are protected under the Japanese Constitution. And we put a protest on our website about the Kannama Union crackdown. And so that's basically where we are right now.
And how many Kannama unionists are in prison right now?
Right now, I'm not sure. I know it's gone down. At one point, it was about 40 or 50, and I think there's a lot fewer now. And some of them have gotten out, and some of them were rearrested and put back in right away. So I'm not exactly sure right now the number. I know Take-san, who's like the president of Kannama, he's still in jail, and he's kind of a hero of the labor movement, and he's 78 years old, or almost 78 years old, and he's been in there more than a year. And what they do is they take a charge, they hold you for the maximum of, I think it's 23 or 24 days, and then they bring a new charge and then repeat the process, and so they end up holding you a long time. And if they indict you, then they can hold you for another 6 months as they prepare the trial. And so it's really shocking.
And this legal structure and the increasing repression, is that an effort really to shut down any kind of labor mobilization in Japan?
Well, yeah, I mean, particularly to shut down effective unions. Kannama was a very effective union and effective union federation. So I think it's pretty clear that the authorities are willing to work with management to weaken effective unions.
And what can trade unionists in the United States, workers in the United States who want to support Kannama and make sure that they get out of jail and they're able to operate as an independent union?
Yeah, well, one thing I think is the more media attention or more social media attention that gets out there about this case, especially in the English language and especially overseas, all that will really put pressure on the Japanese government to, release them and stop the crackdown. So the more attention is given, the better. So even if unions just put a statement on their website, maybe send messages of support, try to contact the media, try to get the local media to cover it, all those things will really help a lot.
And the Japanese government, Abe government, has recently involved in a whole number of corruption scandals. They're continuing with the planning of the Olympics in Fukushima, where, as a matter of fact, they're using a large number of subcontractors in the cleanup of Fukushima.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that?
The subcontractor system for the nuclear power is even worse than what I just described, because there's often 5, 6, 7, even 8 different levels, and as you go down, the conditions are outrageous, and many of the workers are foreigners, and the yakuza, we call yakuza, it's like a Japanese mafia, are often involved in or connected to the management, and so it's a really terrible situation because it's really dangerous. The cleanup, of course, is very dangerous because there's still high levels of radiation, especially near the cores. So this is a real emergency for workers in Fukushima. And I think the decision to have part of the Olympics in Fukushima was a publicity stunt for Abe to show that, nuclear power is fine and everything's fine. You don't have to worry about Fukushima radiation. Of course, it's not fine, and it's going to take decades even to decommission the affected reactors. So this is just using the Olympics and using the health of the athletes in order to make a statement about nuclear power. So.
And Abe told the Olympics Committee and the world that Fukushima has been decontaminated. What you're saying is that that's not accurate, that's not true.
Yeah, that's completely not true. In fact, no human being has actually seen with their own eyes the actual meltdowns. In fact, it was only, I think, last year that even a robot could make it to the area where the fuel was actually had melted down. For many of the robots that were sent in actually died. It even kills robots. That's how strong it is. And what happens is that as they clean up, they put like radioactive dirt and soil in these huge garbage bags. And you can see pictures of fields where there's just tens of thousands of garbage bags full of radioactive dirt and other debris just going on for like just off onto the distance. It's incredible. So it's a really serious situation. Of course, you can't go anywhere near the reactors without protective gear, and even that, the thyroid cancer rates are going up, and there's no real clear plan even to decommission. The government has admitted it's going to take decades to decommission the reactors, but there's no really step-by-step plan. There's no plan about what to do with all the spent fuel and with all the radioactive dirt. And periodically they talk about releasing huge amounts of radioactive water into the ocean. So it's certainly not under control at all. And it's just continuing. It just gets less media attention.
Well, how has the Abe government been able to get away with this? The flagrant lying to the IOC, the flagrant lying to the world about the dangers of Fukushima.
Yeah, this is this is something I wonder about as well. And it's really shocking because there's been so many scandals with the Abe government, including lying and including all kinds of corruption. And yet the LDP, the Liberal Democratic Party, which has been the ruling party for almost the entire time since World War II, they seem to get away with it. And if I talk to ordinary Japanese that I know, a lot of the people say, well, we don't trust the Liberal Democratic Party, but, there's no one else. There's no other alternatives. The other parties, they suck too. So they end up voting for the LDP, I guess, for the sake of continuity or something. But it's certainly not that there's any passionate support for the Liberal Democratic Party or for Abe, for that matter. And he somehow manages to survive.
Now, there is a political development, Taro Yamamoto and his new party. Why don't you talk about that? Because it's pretty unusual development with the disabled people getting elected and him running as an independent first against nuclear power. He was a anti-nuclear activist. What's going on with Taro Yamamoto?
You probably know he used to be a famous actor, and he basically leveraged his fame and celebrity status in order to start a political movement. And I would compare him with Corbyn or Sanders, although he certainly hasn't built such a huge movement yet, and he hasn't, risen in the polls so far. However, he's taken a very clear position against, huge corporations, against the plutocracy in Japan. And, in the recent election, in his party, he put disabled people ahead of himself. So that only if they got elected would he be elected. And one of them was a man with ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. And so that was, and one of the reasons he did it was, he was open about why he was doing it. One of the reasons was he wanted to force the government to create a barrier-free parliament building, because it was not. I'm not sure if they've done that or not, but, because he would have to take his seat in the Congress. And of course, if it wasn't barrier-free, it would be impossible. And he wanted to, raise awareness about the need for barrier-free facilities that are friendly towards the disabled. So another thing is that, I've seen a lot of speeches of his on the street, and he really speaks well. He really captures what's really going on in a very clear, concise way in Japanese. And so that's something I think that's helped his popularity, is that he really boils it down. He doesn't go through political doublespeak or anything like that.
And do you think the likelihood is that his party is going to grow in the next election cycle of the lower house?
I certainly hope so. I think it will a little bit. I think he's got to keep plodding away like Sanders has for, 40 years. And I really look forward to that. And of course, he's very, like you said, he opposes nuclear power a great deal. And I think nuclear power, there isn't really much public support. The government has pushed so hard to try to restart more and more power plants around the country, because after the 2011 disaster, they were all shut off. And then now they've been like one by one trying to start them again, and there's been a lot of opposition. And nobody, like Japanese are not excited about getting back into nuclear power, let alone building new ones. So I think, and even former, political leaders like Koizumi, who is, a really right-wing prime minister, even he opposes nuclear power. And so I think even within the ruling class, there's some dispute about whether Japan really wants to continue with nuclear power. So I look forward to Yamamoto Taro really pushing those issues.
And Japan, the Japanese government has tried to remove Article 9 of the Constitution that prevents war. Mm-hmm. What is going on as far as the remilitarization of Japan, and is there opposition to that? And is the Abe government going to be successful in overturning that clause in the Constitution?
Yeah. Well, Japan has a military, regardless of what the Japanese media say. They have a military. It's been there for a long time. It's called the Self-Defense Forces. It's been there for decades and decades, since soon after World War II. Now, so even the existence of this military is in violation of Article 9 of the Constitution, which says not only that you can't use violence as a means of dispute resolution, but also that Japan cannot even have a military. And so this is a clear violation. So they avoid it by saying that it's not a military, and it's gone to the courts, and some lower courts have actually ruled that it's against the Constitution, that it violates Article 9. However, the Supreme Court always evades the issue by saying this is a political decision and we can't rule on it. So it's managed to survive all this time. So what Abe and his ilk are saying is that, look, we already have what is a military. I mean, they don't use that word, but they certainly make it clear what they mean. So so rather than change reality to comply with the Constitution, let's change the Constitution to, adapt to what the reality is. And of course, they start fear-mongering about North Korea and China and, other countries, that they have to have their own military and not depend on the U.S. and all this stuff. But of course, he wants to get into the game with the U.S. and send troops all over the place. And there's many hurdles for him, because it has to pass, I think, 2/3 of both chambers of the Japanese Diet, and also then it has to be a public referendum that gets a majority. So I think it's really difficult. He's been trying, he controls some of the media, like the NHK and other media, and he's been trying to get higher acceptance of changing it. But most people still are very resistant to taking out Article 9. So at least as of right now, I think Article 9 is safe, at least for a while. But we'll see going forward.
And the political situation in Japan, like Abe, like Trump, is increasing nationalism. How has this nationalism affected Japan, and particularly in relationship to Korea?
Yeah, well, the two main, what's it called? The two main enemies that are always portrayed in the media and among a lot of people in social media as well, have always been, or have long been, China and Korea. Of course, during World War II and before, Japan colonized both countries and brutalized them, including forcing many into sex slavery or forcing them to be slave laborers. And of course, China and Korea remember all this. and Japan, many Japanese either don't know about it or don't want to hear about it. And so there's this really a lot of anger towards China and Korea. And then a few years back, when China GDP surpassed Japan to become the second largest in the world, of course, many Japanese, or I guess media figures, were shocked and horrified that Japan is no longer the second largest economy in the world. So there's, and of course, so there's a lot of anger towards Chinese. On the other hand, the Japanese tourist industry is basically completely dependent on Chinese tourists. I mean, if you go to some places in Osaka, there's like many more Chinese than Japanese. You know, you hear Chinese everywhere. So on the one hand, there's just a lot of racism and prejudice against Chinese, you know, claims that they don't know manners and blah, blah, blah. At the same time, many businesses around Japan benefit a lot from Chinese tourism. And there's kind of a recognition that they just can't ignore China. It's an economic behemoth. It's a military power. It's kind of on a par with the U.S., so they can't completely ignore it. On the other hand, Korea is nowhere near that strong and nowhere near that powerful, so there's a lot of contempt shown towards Korea, even, you know, in the mainstream corporate media. And, you know, there's a really right-wing element where they, you know, march down the street saying, kill Koreans or something like that. But, like, I think what's even more insidious is just the mainstream general contempt shown towards Koreans. And I think that's much worse. And so, yeah.
And what is the role of the labor movement, the unions, in fighting increasing racism and attacks on immigrants?
Did you say what's the role of unions?
Yes. Have unions organized
okay.
against these attacks?
Yeah. Well, we'll see, like, of course, labor unions often have political policies, right? So we, of course, as the most multinational, multicultural union, we have very strong policies about fighting against racism, fighting for equal rights for foreigners, supporting a law to protect foreigners from discrimination. Because although it's technically illegal, according to the Constitution and Labor Standards Act, there's no law in itself devoted to protect foreigners from discrimination. Like for women, at least in the workplace, there's an entire law called the Equal Employment Opportunity Act, and that protects women from gender discrimination. There's no similar law for foreigners, so that's something that for us is very important. The immigrants in Japan, they're kind of split into three different groups, I'd say. So one group is Westerners. Another group is like Latin Americans, including many of Japanese ethnic origin. And the other group is Asian and African foreigners. And so, you know, they kind of are put into, you know, different categories and even different visas. And a couple of years ago, last year, April, Abe has this new immigration policy where he expands the number of foreigners in Japan because there's a perceived shortage of labor in Japan, and there's a recognition that they have no choice but to bring in more foreigners. But they made the conditions so bad and so like severe, like in the first 5 years, like they introduced a new unskilled visa category. Until now, all the visas for foreigners were in a particular category, and they started a new category of unskilled workers, basically targeting Asians and Africans. The thing is that they put so many rules and weird conditions, like they can't bring their family for the first 5 years, and then they have to pass like certain qualifications to extend after that, or they have to go home. And so they didn't really bring in as many as they thought. But that's something that even the right wing, even Liberal Democratic Party, has begun using the word immigration, where before that word was only used for outgoing immigration. So for the first time, the media is even using the word immigration for foreigners coming in. And so that's a big change. However, what we're fighting for is that, okay, yeah, we're happy if they bring more foreigners in, but the conditions, the working conditions, the living conditions have to be fair and equitable and equal with Japanese. So that's something that unions have a very big part to play in. Unions like ours that are multinational, but also Japanese unions, can do a lot if they extend their hand of solidarity to immigrants and immigrant unions.
And the crisis of a declining population in Japan, that is perhaps one of the reasons that they're desperate for more workers. It seems like Japan is in a very great crunch as far as expanding their population. There's supposed to be a major decline. Yeah,
I mean, it's really declining. It's kind of a harbinger for other rich countries. who are also facing such declines. Japan has already begun to decline. It's expected, I think, in a couple of decades to go below 100 million. And as they do this, I mean, what they call labor shortages, I would call wages. There's upward pressure on wages. And of course, if they paid enough wages, they could get enough Japanese even or foreigners to fill the labor shortage gaps. But of course, they don't want to do that. And so they bring in workers from poor countries who you can pay a lot less and put them under kind of insecure conditions. So again, you pay them less. And what that does is it also lowers the wages of Japanese workers, or at least puts downward pressure. So I kind of hesitate to even use the word labor shortage, because what it really is just supply and demand pushing wages up, and business is doing everything to prevent that. So the population decline, yeah, that's definitely the major factor in it. And one of the reasons for the population decline, of course, one of the reasons was because Japan is a rich country and since the 80s and 90s has been very well off. Another reason is that it's insanely expensive to raise a child in Japan. Even though public school is free up until middle school, there's so many costs associated with raising with a school, such as materials and uniforms and stuff like that. It's not really free. And of course, there's I shouldn't say of course, there are many shortages in terms of like nursing schools and kindergartens. So it's very hard for parents to find, childcare, when the kids are really young before they go to school. And then everything is just so expensive. It's related to children. Housing, of course, in Japan is expensive and it's small. And so, having a car is incredibly expensive. So it's really expensive and difficult to have children. So nowadays you see very few families with more than one child, if that. And of course, many parents just don't, or many couples don't even have children. So all these factors are playing in. So the Abe government is trying to at least make gestures, to increasing the number of daycare centers, or, doing something to make it cheaper or easier to have children. And one of the things they did, which was good in terms of labor law, was it used to be just maternity leave, right? If you worked at a place, you get maternity leave and maternity and childcare leave. So only the mother could get childcare leave for like a year or a year and a half after birth. Then they said, okay, mother or father can do it, maternity or paternity. And then now both parents can do it simultaneously. So if they both have jobs and they have a child, both parents can take a year off at least for childcare. So that's something that they've been trying to do to make it, easier to have a child.
Okay, well, I want to thank you very much. We've been talking with Louis Carlet. He's with the union Tozen in Tokyo, and he's been talking about the labor situation in Japan, struggle of the Kanama construction workers, and what is happening. So thanks for joining us on WorkWeek Radio.
Yeah, thank you very much.